Good afternoon and welcome to this joint BSI-IFE webinar in which we'll be looking at the impact of the Fire Safety England Regulations 2022. For those of us that have not met before, my name is Ant Bird and I'm Head of Built Environment at BSI, sitting within the Standards and National Standards Body part of the BSI group. And it's my privilege today to be your host for this afternoon's webinar. Next slide, please. But before we get started, a bit of housekeeping, if I may, first. As I'm sure all of the delegates are aware this afternoon, this is a listen-only webinar, but it is being recorded. That means we still really welcome your questions via the Q&A function that you have on your panel before you there. We have one speaker today, one guest speaker, and we will hold a Q&A session at the end of his presentation. As I say, simply click on the Q&A button in the side panel and please do post your question and they will come direct to me. A number of you have already provided an awful lot of questions as part of the application process for today's webinar, and I've got those too. But please do keep them coming forward. If you do experience any technical difficulties today, please just submit your issue via the Q&A function that you have there before you as well. And the team that are working hard to run this show will, I'm sure, be able to help you very quickly and smoothly and alleviate any of your problems that you might be experiencing with the platform. As is normally the way with BSI events of this nature, we would really welcome completion of the feedback survey at the end of this session. Yeah, be brutally honest, tell us what you think, tell us what worked, tell us what didn't work, and where you're able to, if you can think about what other areas you'd like us to explore as part of the IFE BSI jointly approached webinar series in terms of other things you would like covered, don't hesitate to tell us. That would be really helpful and we'll see what we can do and bring back to you at a future event. Again, as explained as part of the signing up for this event today, BSI will send you a link to the recording of the webinar following its completion, and thereafter please do feel free to share that around colleagues, sector, maybe some of your stakeholders if you think they would find it useful too, given the subject that we're talking about today. As is per normal, this is a CPD registered webinar. Like me, for many of my professional institutions, including the IFE, I need to report these back, so please do request your certificate via the feedback survey and that will be made available to you as well. Next slide, please. So we're here to consider the impact of the new Fire Safety England Regulations 2022. I think it's fair to say in the 34 years that I've worked in this industry, much of that time working within the building regulations and with fire safety legislation, I believe what we are witnessing now amounts to the biggest set of wholesale changes we've ever seen when it comes to building and fire safety. Anyway, enough of me. I would just like to introduce and welcome Nick Coombe today, our guest speaker. Nick is known to a great many of us, but I think it is worth just reminding you of Nick's background. Some 40 years service for the London Fire Brigade. He's actually undertaken many roles, including Head of Fire Safety Training, Enforcement Manager, and Head of Fire Safety Policy. He has also helped along the way DCLG, Relevant Government Department, now DCLG, write technical guides to aid understanding and appreciation of fire safety legislation. He's also has held chair of the Fire Enforcement Working Group, which helped produce policies and guidance to support the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order and the Fire and Rescue Services at large. Nick is currently NFCC Protection Vice Chair and Head of Protection Policy and Reform Unit, which leads the Building Safety Programme. He's a member of the Joint Regulators Group and the Protection Board, and he is also a member of the Industry Safety Steering Group led by Dame Judith Hackett, set up to definitively hold industry to account on the progress of post-Grenfell change. He was a founder member of the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council and is also chair of the IFE's Fire Risk Assessment Register. He sits on various British standing committees, which I'm extremely grateful for, and I'm extremely grateful for all committee experts, some of whom join us today, and nominating bodies such as the IFE, for the time you all give to contribute to standardisation. BSI, as the UK's national standards body, couldn't do it without you, so thank you. And to bring it all to a lovely piece in 2019, in the New Year's Honours list, Nick was awarded an MBE for services to fire safety, and richly deserved. Nick, welcome. Over to you.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon, Ian. Thanks, BSI and IFE, for inviting me. Although it's around the Fire Safety England regulations I'm going to deal with, I'm just going to do a little bit around the Fire Safety Act, because without that Act, the Fire Safety England regulations couldn't actually happen. So next slide, please. So the Fire Safety Act, the Fire Safety Act clarifies that the structure, external wall and front doors and other doors and balconies should now be part of your fire risk assessment for residential buildings. The Act was passed on the 16th of May this year, and guidance was issued by the Home Office to assist responsible persons and enforcing authorities. One of the little things around the Fire Safety Act was how it changed Article 50, that gave it a bit more standing around whether you use the guidance supplied or not, and how it can help with your compliance. So that was stuck away in that Fire Safety Act. Next slide, please. One of the issues we had is, obviously, prior to the Fire Safety Act, external walls weren't really considered in buildings, whether they comply, whether they were part of the fire safety order or not. And there'll be some different types of competencies required when doing it. And there's a couple of pictures there that kind of show from your kind of terraced house that happens to have 2 flats in it, and therefore, and brick and tile, and which you won't need much expertise to decide that, to the other picture, which is a glorified modern day treehouse by the look of it, covered in wood, and you'll need some kind of expertise to ascertain what the risk from that wall is. Being there's 1.7 million premises that needed their FRAs updated, there is obviously a capacity angle in the market around, especially at the top end, for experienced people who can access external walls. So something needed to be done to assist responsible persons, because what the government didn't want is, the day the Act came in, people are non-compliant with the law. So they introduced what they called the FRAP tool, which is a fire risk assessment prioritization tool, to try and help responsible persons decide which premises they needed to carry out the external wall survey first. One of the things I think, though, that's kind of been forgotten around this is around other non-residential buildings. It was always known that non-residential buildings, the whole building complied with the fire safety order, but very, very few fire risk assessments considered the external walls in premises like hospitals, libraries, shops, etc. So that's probably something else fire and rescue services will be looking at when they go out and do their audits, around how responsible persons and their risk assessors are looking at external walls in non-residential premises. So there's a bit of a heads up there for you as well. Next slide, please. So the fire risk assessment prioritization tool was mainly designed for large portfolio holders. These were for local authorities and large social landlords who had, thousands of buildings and had to try and prioritize how they would do the assessment of the external wall. So they came up with a tool that's available on the government website. Only the RP should complete it. It is non-mandatory, you don't have to do it, because some social landlords had already gone about prioritising their portfolio, so we felt it was wrong to make them go a step backwards and kind of use this tool. And again, it's got Article 50 guidance, so that will help if you do use it, if you are visited by enforcing authorities. Next slide, please. So what the tool does, by using several factors, it attempts to prioritise their fire risk assessment programme. It looks at the height of the building, the type of external wall system you've got in it, whether you've got balconies or not, how many staircases, what the fire doors are like, what were the outcomes of previous fire risk assessments, whether there's detection in flats, and whether it's specialised housing or not. Because remember, the Fire Safety Act is not around height; it's around all buildings with more than one residential premises in it, which is why I showed that picture earlier. It's not a perfect tool. It was never designed to be. So it is one that you know, you should use. But remember, it's not going to be the perfect outcome. But what it should do, it should categorise premises into one of 5 tiers. And tier 1 means you need immediate action. Otherwise, what you've put on there means you should be doing something about the risk of that wall. And that will generally be very tall, got some kind of aluminium composite cladding or non-combustible cladding, single staircase, and a number of other issues. And it'll go right down to probably tiers 4 and 5, where you only need to look at the external wall as part of your normal FRA cycle. And when fire and rescue services inspect premises and they say, have you considered your external wall, it'll give RPs the opportunity to be able to say, no, I've put my building in the system, it's come out do as per normal when I do my FRA cycle, so my next FRA is not due for a year or 2, and I'll pick it up then. And FRS need to consider that if they're going to take any enforcement action. Obviously, if it's not what it says on the tin, i.e. you're saying it's very low risk and it appears that it's not, then obviously FRS can take action. But hopefully people will use the tool well, and it will give them that breathing space to ensure that over the next few years, they'll be able to get their portfolio in order. Okay, next slide, please. So the day after the Fire Safety Act, the Fire Safety England regulations were laid. Next slide, please. And these will implement most of the phase 1 recommendations which required a change in law. As I said, they were laid after the Fire Safety Act, but they're not actually in force until the 23rd of January next year. This was to allow, again, RPs to get ready, to get their information, to get their processes in place, ready for the 23rd of January. And it puts duties on all RPs for all buildings, again, that contains 2 or more residential units. But obviously there's going to be stricter requirements for high-rise residential buildings. And there is a significant amount of sharing information with fire and rescue services that need to happen. Next slide, please. So first thing they did was obviously define what a HRRB is. We know it as a high-rise residential building. It's the same definition that is used in the Building Safety Act, at least 18 metres in height, got to have 2 or more sets of domestic premises, or has at least 7 stories, because sometimes the measurement's not quite right. So, and there's been a lot of gaming going along. So if it's either 7 stories, you're in. If it's 18 metres and above, you're in. Okay, as long as it's got that 2 sets of domestic premises. And this brings in some unique kind of buildings, because there's lots of tall buildings in major city centres that may have a couple of penthouse flats, but they may not be purely residential. The Shard is a typical example where it's got shops, hotel, but there is some residential in there. So this will then come into the Fire Safety England regs as well. So we're not just talking about blocks of flats, although that is predominantly what this is aimed of. Obviously, following the tragedy at Grenfell, it does bring in other buildings. There's also some information about, you know, stories below ground floor, how to include a mezzanine floor or not, as the case may be, and how that is done. Okay, next slide, please. So the next regulation only applies to these HRRBs. And what this basically says is that the responsible person has to install and maintain what they're calling a secure information box. A lot of you will know this as a premises information box. Home Office didn't want to use that term. They felt it was a trademark of a certain well-known supplier and didn't want to go down that term, even though my understanding is that particular body gave permission to use the PIB, because they said quite rightly everyone knows it as a PIB, and so therefore why change it? But they didn't listen, and it's now called an SIB. And although this is a requirement retrospectively for buildings over 18 metres, don't forget in the new approved document B later on this year, there'll be all new blocks over 11 metres. And what it has to be able to do, it's got to be in a location that is readily accessible for the fire and rescue ferry. So my first ask, if you are going to install one of these boxes, talk to your local fire and rescue service where the best access for them is. Most of the time it will probably be obvious, but sometimes it might not be, depending on their firefighting operations. You don't want it directly above a dry riser where it could, could be impeded by people doing work and things like that. It obviously needs to be able to hold the documentation that's needed, that's required later in the regulations, and should be reasonably secure from unauthorised access and vandalism. Some of the new information that's not been made by law to record are things like the name and address and telephone number within the UK of the responsible person. So therefore, there's got to be a UK address. And then also any key holder or other people who have access to the building who can help the fire and rescue service. You have to remember that these regulations are aimed at operations. So they're more aimed at the operational response of the fire and rescue service rather than the fire safety arm. Although because it's under the fire safety order, then it will be the protection teams that will be checking compliance through this. One of the key ones is the responsible person must provide the local fire and rescue authority with anything required to be able to access it. Now, obviously, one of the worries is that, you can put a fairly secure box up and then you give the keys to the local fire station. Well, obviously, you can't guarantee that local fire station will be the appliance in attendance. So it could be a further one, could even sometimes be from another brigade. So it needs some kind of standardisation key, or fire and rescue service will gain access to that SIB one way or the other. What you don't want is every time they have to access it, you have to replace it afterwards. So you need to talk to your fire and rescue service to come up with a way that it can be accessed by whoever's attending at that time. Or you might have a concierge who might be able to be on 24/7. Who will just say, well, I'll be there, or someone will be there, and they'll open it on arrival. This can be agreed as well. Again, it puts this responsibility on, you have to inspect it at least annually, ensure it continues to meet the requirements. And again, that has to be documented and checked. Next slide, please. So again, only for HRRBs, and this is about design and materials of external walls. Obviously, following the tragedy of Grenfell, it became obvious that fire and rescue services would have helped if they'd have known the makeup of the external wall, how it would react in a fire, and how they would deal with that. So what they're asking the RP to do is to prepare a record of the design of the external walls of the building, including the details of the materials from which they are constructed. And then this must include the details of the level of the risk identified. And this is the key bit for this. I can't stress enough that firefighters are not fire safety experts. They're definitely not external wall experts. And so if the information you provide is too hard level about, what the membrane's made of, they're not interested. All they really want to know is, should the external wall be subject to fire, i.e. a window breaking out of a fire breaking out of a window of a flat, is it likely to spread quickly or do what it's meant to do and be normal kind of fire spread? There will always be external fire spread. We know that. We know that happens, but what we don't want is see events like that happened at Grenfell and where we've seen it in other places around the world. So I would imagine in the current properties that still have highly combustible cladding on the outside, when they are complying with its regulations, they would have to provide details of what it is, and then that it is a serious risk to external fire spread. Okay, so when the first crews turn up and they see that, they'll know that it might affect their tactical plan. How is it going to work? Is it a case of we have to start evacuating and actually leave the firefighting until a later date, or no, we don't have to. If it's a normal building, it's going to behave the way it should do, and then we can do what firefighters do and just attack the fire from inside the flat, etc., etc. And again, once that's changed, hopefully when the buildings are remediated and there is any kind of change to the external wall, that must be recorded as well. Okay, next slide, please. One of the issues identified in Grenfell was lack of plans, and this is met with a bit of, well, all flat, one flat floor looks the same as the other, and they've kind of accounted for that as well. If all the flats are the same, the floors are the same, then you only need to provide one single kind of floor plan layout. But it also talks about the building, and I'll go on to that in a minute. And again, work with your local fire and rescue service, because although the requirements, talk about one plan, and it should provide certain information like where the lifts are that are used by firefighters and key firefighting equipment, which I'll detail later. It might be you might want to do more than one copy, because what will normally happen is copies will be taken inside, copies will go on the command unit. Yes, some fire and rescue services have the ability to make copies, but not normally initial appliances. So again, although the legislation says one thing, best practice might be to provide more laminated. They'll get filthy during an incident, because that's what will happen. And they might get lost as well, unfortunately, because a firefighter might put it down at the end of the incident, and so it's something else we need to think about. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the single building plan, okay? And these are the kind of equipment, the kind of information it should have on it, and I've highlighted access for fire and rescue appliances. Really key area, because again, we want RPs to learn where they are to ensure things like parking don't happen. I mean, I did a lot of my firefighting career in South London around Brixton and the Old Kent Road, and we were forever unable to get as close as we would like to blocks of flats because of bad parking or bad design as such. So it's something that we want RPs to think about, and even where they can, mark it out, especially for high-rise appliances. High-rise appliances need some significant floor space to be able to put the jacks out and things like that if they're really going to get to work. The dimensions of the building it wants, number of stories, where the numbers are. I mean, sometimes it's really confusing around what numbers they are. Those who might remember the Lacanau house fire, the floor numbers weren't the same on each floor. When you go into things like hotels, normally, first floor is 101, 102, second floor 201. That doesn't happen in a block of flats. It can be really confusing. You can have number 45 on the third floor or number 45 on the 8th floor. So having that information at hand to crews will make it really easy, not just for firefighting, for any kind of incident they attend, with fire and rescue services taking part more in kind of co-responding, helping out the ambulances. Having information to hand really quickly can really save lives. Knowing where the dry risers are, knowing where the wet risers are, any shut-offs is really, really important. with the upsurge of domestic sprinklers going in, we've now got it over 11 meters. Knowing where the cut-offs, them kind of thing, can stop the damage when required. So really important stuff here. I'm not going to read it all, it's there, but I think this is a key plan for fire and rescue service. And also I think it's helpful for the RP to understand where this key stuff is to ensure that it can be maintained and looked after moving forward. Next slide, please. So what we're asking for is a hard copy of the floor plans and building plan in the secure information box. And again, although it's only asking for one copy, talk to your local fire and rescue services. They might like a couple more laminated, etc., that might help them. And again, it's your responsibility to make, if there are any changes that happen during the time, and this could be temporary changes, building works going on, access might be different, you know, dry risers may be different to be accessed, so that needs to be updated at time. But I did say I'd talk to you about key firefighting equipment, and for this particular regulation, it is inlets and outlets for the dry and wet rising mains, smoke control systems and suppression systems. So a smoke control system being really key in a block of flats, and we'll talk a little bit about more of that, about why that is in a minute. Okay, next slide, please. So again, there was issue with the firefighting lift at Grenfell Tower. So, and following Grenfell Tower, when fire and rescue services started to, you know, hit, as they called it, with the BRR high rise, there was a number of firefighting lifts that never worked correctly. You know, they were accessed, they didn't return to ground floor, or when they did, you couldn't operate them. So they weren't obviously being tested and maintained in accordance. So this regulation has come in again only for high-rise residential, that monthly routine checks. Now I have to stress here that this is a check. This is a check about that it's there and the key works. This is not the same as the testing regime that these lifts need to have, these outlined in British standards. This is a check. Okay, and then obviously if you identify an issue, you're going to have to do something about that. Okay, and as you see, because where a fault is identified and it cannot be rectified in 24 hours, then you have to notify your local fire and rescue service, and we'll talk about how that's to be. Fire and rescue services are going to set up the kind of mail addresses for you to do, because what we don't want is people who know people in their fire and rescue service or know the number of their local fire and rescue station just ringing up, or you know, sending an email to Station Officer Jones who they know. There's got to be a proper system so it can be monitored by fire and rescue services, put on things like their MDTs, which is their kind of terminals that they have where important information is stored. So that goes on every appliance rather than just one, because as I said, it may not always be the local station turning up. You also, this should be by electronic means, and then you also have to tell them if that fault has been rectified so they can clear it. Now, the issues with some of this key firefighting equipment, including lifts, is fire and rescue services may have to alter their tactical plan. If they know the firefighting lift is not working and it's a very, very tall building, probably one of the things they will do is increase the PDA, the predetermined attendance to that building, because they know they're going to have to carry the gear up a certain amount of flights. So they will need more resources to get there. And that's why it's key that we know that information in advance so we can plan for it, rather than turning up on the day, realizing the lift's not work, and then we have to request additional resources, which take further time. And obviously we want to know when it's fixed, because we don't want to send additional appliances where they're no longer necessary, taking away from other vital calls. And again, they must record the monthly checks. So in this one, it includes the essential firefighting equipment that I said before. So if an inlet breaks, an outlet breaks, the smoke control system, the suppression system, the lifts, the evacuation lifts, but it also adds any fire detection and fire alarm systems linked to any ancillary equipment, such as smoke control systems, and any evacuation alert systems as well, or any automatic door release system. So it's not meaning the fire detection and fire alarm systems in the domestic premises. It only means the ones that are linked to any of the ancillary equipment. Also, one of the things around the smoke control system, if your smoke control system is not working, you have an issue with your building, because what that means is it won't be able to get rid of the smoke should a fire occur. And you've got to think about what you're going to do as a mitigating measure about that. So identifying it, reporting it is not the end of that. You need to do some more measures. And same for some of the others. It may mean you have to mark it up, you know, put a sign. So even if you tell the fire and rescue service, put a sign on it to say the lift's not working or the outlet's not working, so they know as well. Okay, so as you can see, what it says, routine check means to check that any lift or piece of equipment is in efficient working order and in good repair. And, you know, but it's not the routine testing and maintenance that are laid down in other standards. Next slide, please. So this is again for high-rise building, and again, don't forget wayfinder signage is going into new builds. So, but this is retrospectively. So the responsible person has to ensure that the building contains clear markings of floor identification and identification of domestic premises, and it tells you how to follow it using approved document B. It's actually very, very useful for fire and rescue services to see that. We've had some other issues with not being able to identify which floor we're on. Imagine carrying a load of equipment up a number of floors. It is quite easy to become disorientated about where you are. Okay, next slide, please. So the previous ones I just did were about high-rise residential building. Now you've got a regulation that is for all flats, regardless of the height. So any building that contains 2 or more flats, and I'll go back to that picture I showed you with the flat A and B, you're going to have to follow that for this. And this is information to residents. Obviously, it can't just have 2 flats, it's got to have common parts, but it's very hard not to have common parts when you've got 2 flats. And it says they must be in a comprehensive form that the residents can easily expect to understand. You may have to think about foreign languages, pictograms may be the answer to give that information across. Again, your local fire and rescue service will help you around this if you're not sure. What the strategy of the building is. It was quite remarkable when you listen to both the Lacanau coroner's inquest and the public inquiry, how many people didn't know the evacuation strategy of their tower at that time, you know, and so that needs to be communicated. How to report a fire, how to call the fire and rescue service, all common sense stuff. But I think you need to make sure that it gets done, especially with the change of tenants and leaseholders that we have. And they must provide a copy of these instructions to a new residents as soon as reasonably practical, and to all residents each 12-month period, beginning with the date of these regulations. So 21st January 23rd, you have to give the information, and then every year after that, you have to repeat that information. Okay, and then if anyone new comes on, as soon as reasonably practical. And if they change, obviously you have to start the process again. Okay, next slide, please. Fire doors, very contentious in Grenfell because of the testing regime, etc., etc. So again, this is for all flats, and it talks about the fact that the responsible person, you know, which contains common parts which must provide the required information about fire doors to residents. And this should be about when they need to be kept shut. They shouldn't tamper with them, you know, with the self-closing devices. You know, the amount of flats in Grenfell that didn't have a self-closing device, you know, whether they were taken off by the resident, whether they didn't have one in the first place, they should be known. I think what happens a lot of the time, people get locked out of their flat because the door shuts and they think that's not happening again, or they're worried about it, they take them off. But this is instructions, they know they can't do it. and also for them to report any defects, etc., immediately to the RP. And again, it's the same thing, do it every 12 months and any new residents. I think the key about the importance of it, I think there'll be people listening to this going, that some of our residents wouldn't care, they don't care. And I get that. There's a different, demographics in flats, from your multi-million-pound flats to some of our social, but I think the majority of people want to ensure they're safe, and hopefully they'll take this on board. Okay, next slide, please. So this is one which for 11 meters. Okay, so, and that includes obviously the 18 above, because it's above 11 meters. So the responsible person in which building contains 2 or more domestic premises above 11 meters in height must use best endeavours. I need to probably stop there, because you're probably, I'm half expecting one of the questions to be best endeavours, and my answer is I don't know. I think I can tell you what I think it is, but I think I'll find only a court of law will ever decide what best endeavours really was. Okay, I think what the Fire and Rescue Service will be looking for is a suitable system that you've put in place to undertake checks of these doors, of the front doors, which is every 12 months, and you keep a record of that. We know the problems around gaining access to certain front doors of flats. So have you got a system in place? How many times have you tried? That to me is best endeavours. If you just try once, is that enough? Obviously, we're not expected to try every day, every week, because we know that is onerous. But you have to demonstrate that you've done what's all reasonably practicable, which is in the law, and record where it's not been granted. Keep all this evidence, keep the evidence about when you tried, how you tried, and you never got access to that. So again, in the communal areas above 11 meters, it's every 3 months you need to do the job. So 12 months best endeavours, 12 months for the flat doors. And of course, they remove the best endeavours for communal ones, because there should be no reason why you can't get access to them to do that. And again, they are checks. They are not, your fire risk assessor looks at the state of the doors and how they are. These are checks that, the only stipulation is they must include that you have checked the self-closing devices working. And again, the height is measured by the same way you measure for the 18 meters as laid down in approved document B. Okay, next slide, please. So, what I said at the beginning about some information sharing to the local fire and rescue service. So what we need to see is this is what you've got to give to the fire and rescue service, as well as put it in the SIB. You have to send to us the design of materials and external walls and that risk, so we can pre-plan, because as I said to you before, it'd be really important if we knew the makeup of the wall and the risk to it. What we don't want is the first time we realise that external wall may be high risk is when that first firefighter or incident commander opens up the SIB and finds out, oh my God, this could go pear-shaped. So if you send it to us, which you've got to, we'll be able to put that tactical plan, increase our PDA, bring on aerials, etc. if required. Okay, so we need that. And same as the floor plans and the building plan, that will give us a heads up if we want to do exercises, or the incident commander can be looking at the layout, especially some of the scissor type flat layouts, or where unusual layouts of flats are. So they're the 2 things you're going to have to send electronically. And I talk about how fire and rescue services are helping with that, because in the guidance, there's no kind of set out about, scale, what symbols they are. And of course, what we don't want is plans being sent in done by crayon with, S for smoke detector, L for lift, when there are British standard, symbols, etc. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, about the FIA and NFCC code of practice, which is a kind of best practice guidance. It goes above what's required in the regulations, but it gives you some really good, useful information in there. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the things that's really important is about there were some real issues around the cost to this, to responsible persons. This regular checking, regular information, it is an additional cost. Passing that cost on to leaseholders has been a big issue around other things in the built safety regime. So what they have decided to do is that after no more 5 years, the Secretary of State must review whether this is working. Is it achieving what it was meant to do? Okay, and there may be some changes coming if it's decided it's onerous or doesn't achieve it. So I think this duty to review is a really good idea in there, that you can that at least it's not done now, put to bed, and then decided, oh well, we won't ever change that. I think that's a really good win around reviewing it, because I think there are some issues around some of the stuff there that we'll need to see how it actually works in practice to understand if it is meeting the objectives of the phase 1 of Grenfell, and if not, how do we change that and ensure that the events don't happen again. Okay, next slide, please. I thought that was the last one.
Thank you, Nick. If you want to turn your camera on, fella, and we can take Q&As. Thank you as always. Loads of questions. Do keep them coming in, please. But I better start by saying there's loads of nice, well, not really questions, they're comments of just commending you on your presentation and asking a few more questions just to do at a later date, Nick. So we'll pass those over to you, fellows.
Yeah, no worries.
Anyway, thank you for that. Very thorough, an awful lot there. And hence we've got quite a few questions. You've touched upon this in your presentation, but we've had a couple of questions come in. This is fantastic, and people will make use of this presentation material and share it. Would you point to any other sources of information about the Act, be it Home Office, NFCC, IFE, similar? What would you recommend for getting more information?
Yeah, so when we knew this was happening, the FIA and NFCC put together some people who worked on a code of practice for premises information boxes and information. As I said, it is a gold standard document. It goes above what is required in these regulations, but it will give you a really good steering point around how we would like the plans to be submitted. As I said, I talked about, we want standardized plans. I was disappointed that there wasn't so much of a stressful out on the Article 50 guidance. And so you could end up with a load of different size plans, from A3 to A4 to A0. And I can imagine some firefighter, 3 o'clock in the morning trying to pull out an A0 plan, when it's pouring with rain, trying to make head and tail of it. I know what's going to happen to that. So what we're also doing is we're providing, NFCC via the 40+ fire and rescue services are going to provide a platform where we will have some templates that you can use. Again, not mandatory because this is the way it works, but be really good if you go on there. I can't give it at the moment, but as soon as I have it, I will give you a link that you'll be able to send to everyone who attended today so they can go in and have a look. It's been out for consultation with fire and rescue services. So, and obviously, because I'm being a bit selfish in the sense, although we have involved housing providers, this information is for that firefighter or that incident commander on site. So it has to be very brisk. They haven't got a lot of time in a dynamic situation to have a load of information. It's got to be, very easy to understand, and friends of ours, Mr. Todd will tell you what he thinks of the intelligence of a firefighter. So, so we need to make sure that they're easily understandable. So we are doing some work on that. So, again, and again, I can only stress, go and talk to your local fire and rescue service, especially if you've got a large number of buildings, and you're worried about how you're going to do all this. Go and talk to them and speak to their heads of protection about how you can meet this and what you can do. But there's definitely the FIA guide, and I'm sure we can provide a link to that later on if people haven't got it.
That's brilliant. If you can send that over, and for delegates today, more than happy to make that information available and point them in the right direction. So brilliant, thank you, Nick. So if I try and break down an awful lot of questions, I think we've got a meaningful amount of time. We'll start actually with the Act itself. The clue's probably in the title, certainly of the secondary legislation in the regs. But just to reiterate, this is applicable to England only.
England, yes. My understanding is Wales are going to introduce something similar.
Right.
They haven't done it yet, but they will do. And obviously Scotland's and Northern Ireland's legislation is slightly different, but they're ahead of the game in some cases out there. But this is particularly for England, yes. I do think though, if you do happen to have cross-border, why wouldn't you want to do this stuff anyway? It could save people's lives in the future. Having that early information, reporting defects, understanding, checking this stuff. I don't understand why you wouldn't do it just because I don't happen to live in England.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. Staying with the Act itself and the regulations there too, not an uncommon one we get in terms of almost transitional. Question here from Michael: is there a grace period following the 23rd of January if, I presume, corrective works are programmed in and will commence?
It's a really good question, because the grace period was the reason why it didn't come in on the 17th of May to January. I think for if the lifts or the smoke control system isn't working before that, I still don't understand why you wouldn't tell the fire and rescue service as soon as you put. I mean, I don't know why you haven't told the fire and rescue service already. Why are you waiting until January? So because there are some key bits about firefighting equipment. If they're not working, will delay our response. And the rest of it is around information. Obviously, fire and rescue services can't get to many premises. We haven't got the resources, but we will be asking them questions when we do inspect high-rise blocks of flats around the plans. I'd expect fire and rescue services to start checking SIBs. We don't know whether there's going to be an issue around obtaining and installing SIBs. There's been this, it worked out about 8 months grace. No one has come to us and said, I'm a large social housing provider. I've ordered 1,000 SIBs. Unfortunately, the company can't get them to me till March. If you know that, come and talk to me, and I can talk to the Home Office. And we won't delay the regs. We can't because of the statute, but we can probably talk to fire and rescue services and say this particular premises is trying their best, and that's it. The answer to your question is, if we can see some kind of activity, some movement towards it, we are going to be sympathetic towards that, and that's what we are. It's obviously the people who will do nothing. That first high-rise fire, after it, we turn up, there's no SIB, there's no plans, the lift weren't working. We're going to hold you to account, and we should do.
Brilliant, thank you. Again, staying with the legislation, question here from Matthew. Good to see you, Matthew. Hear from you. How does this Act define balconies?
Well, the regulations, I mean, that doesn't. I mean, I think the Fire Safety Act doesn't do it either. I think you're going to have to go and look in how it's designed elsewhere. The only one of the issues we've been brought is about the one where it basically stops you. You either open the door inwards and there's a kind of screen there that stops you falling out. I don't believe that's a balcony. If there's access that people can get on it, then to me that's a balcony. I think the biggest issue is, how will fire risk assessors, how will RPs get access to that, especially ones that you can't actually see? There's always the talk around, go on the outside. If you see them stored with stuff, you can take action. Yes, but nowadays there are balconies you can't even see through to see what's there, and so you won't know. And this is another thing around, have a plan in place to get access to the balconies. Give regular information to your residents around, don't have fire, don't have barbecues on balconies, don't smoke on balconies. They will, I know some will, but you have made that due diligence to say, I told you again, and I told you again. What more can I do? And that's the right way, really. If you can demonstrate that you've done all what's reasonable, that's it. So it weren't the exact answer. I wish I could give you one, but again, I think it's one of them ones that only time will tell, really.
Yeah, we used to have a saying for building regs: if it looks and feels like something, it probably is. If it looks and
Yeah,
feels like a balcony, it's a
it's
balcony.
a balcony. Yeah.
Okay. Another question coming. Apart from notifying the FRS if essential firefighting equipment is not working, what else should be done?
So it does depend on the equipment. What I like to harbour on is the smoke control system, because that is a real a real kind of piece of equipment that if it's not working correctly, how can you assure if people are getting out their flats they're not going to come into a smoke-filled corridor? I think if that's going to be out for some time, you really need to think about putting in some interim arrangements. Now, waking watch seems to be a bad word, but they are a legitimate way of moving people quicker if they need to. If it's just an inlet or an outlet, an inlet is obviously more important, because obviously if we can't put the water in there, then we're not going to get it to use it. So again, fire and rescue services will know. I think in something like that, it's probably them will have to do more. They might have to use their light portable pumps if they're going to have to do water relay up an internal staircase, which is extremely hard work, but it has been done. If it's an inlet on a floor, it's just having a tag on it. I think this is the bit that, although the regulations tell you that you've got to report it, I think just little things. I'm convinced if there'd have been a sign on Grenfell saying lift out of order, they wouldn't have spent that time trying to get it to work. So
Yeah,
simple things like that are not in the legislation, but that can really help on the night. As I said, fire services have got a lot on their mind when they turn up and it's a real incident,
yeah,
and just to see a sign saying out of order, great, I know what I've got to do, even if I've had it before. So just things like that really, I think is
brilliant.
important. And also think around, if your evacuation lifts are out of order and they're in there for particular people, what are you going to do about them in an emergency? You might be able to use the firefighting lift if it's got one as well, before the arrival of the firefighter. So it's that kind of stuff. What I'm not going to say is you've got to review your fire risk assessment every time. I think that is too onerous, because in some of our inner city blocks of flats, equipment gets broken quite regularly,
Yeah,
and if you're you know
yeah,
and if you're forever bringing your fire risk assessor in, that will make this, people won't do it, and then that will make it onerous and it won't achieve the objective. So just and again, we will have times when it wasn't identified as broken until the night. If you've done your checks and they were fine,
yeah.
that lift might break down the moment you've left that check, and for the next
Yeah.
one a month later. So we're not saying every time it breaks down you've committed an offence. That's not necessary. All you then got to show is that you've done that due diligence and you've thought about it. It's getting people, I think, for me, as I said, this is about operational, but I think this starts getting people really thinking about them
Yeah,
facilities for firefighters, and how they impact on the management of that building. So I think it's a really good thing for that as well.
no, brilliant. Thank you. Can we just stay with this? Because obviously we're talking about the responsible person and what they should and shouldn't be doing. I've got a question here from Jeff talking about knowing the different standards of firemen's and firefighting lifts over the years. Will the fire service need to keep records on the standard of lift installed to determine the level of reliance on the lift that can be given?
It's a really good question. Obviously, there are three kind of lifts, aren't there, from depending on when it was built,
Yeah,
etc. And one of the things, again, is not in the legislation, but is in this code of practice. The FIA says identify whether it is a fireman's lift, and I'm not being sexist. That's what it was called, and it's called
yeah,
the firefighting lift and the firefighter's lift. Understand what lift you've got. I'm not going to sit here and say every firefighter knows the difference, because they don't. I know that, but I would say more firefighters know the difference than some RPs. So understand what lift you've got, ensure it's labelled as such, because people tend to just buy the fireman sticker or the firefighting sticker because that's the one they saw in the catalogue, and they don't understand that, as I said, there are different capabilities with each of them lifts. And that will be for the fire and rescue service to know that and know them different capabilities. But the first bit is identify the type of lift you've got and send that in the information to your fire and rescue service. we have this style of lift. And think about when you are upgrading lifts, and I've seen this so many times, they upgrade the passenger bit of it, but keep the fire bit the same. You know, and there is now a standard, a British standard about how to upgrade your lifts and all that kind of stuff. So really good question. And as I said, but again, it's what I said. This is about RPs learning about it, because they wouldn't know the difference between the three lifts, but they need to really understand it now.
Absolutely. We've got time for one more question. We've got loads of questions, Nick, but we've only got time for one more. And I can't not ask this one, can I? This has come from Mark. Will there ever be further guidance to when PAS 9980 fire risk appraisals are or are not required? Assessors appear to have no choice but to recommend a full appraisal for nearly all blocks, other than those definitively with masonry and no balconies with timber.
Again, a really, really good question. My understanding is the Fire Sector Federation with IFSM are trying to produce some guidance for that lower end that we talked about. As you said, there are bits that, yes, we get the brick, we get the concrete, but what about the bits where there is some combustible on there? What we don't want is everyone defaulting to the PAS 9980. A, we haven't got the capacity, and B, it costs money. So I'm hoping there will be some guidance coming on that in the not too distant future to help fire risk assessors determine when. And again, I think there is a role for fire risk assessors. You are employed to assess the risk, and I'm not saying go above your competence, but I think it's also been very easy recently to go, oh no, can't do that, because they don't want to get involved, they don't want to put their name on the line. But that's your role as a fire risk assessor. You are assessing that risk. And as I said, if it is a very elaborate, complex system on the outside, of course get an expert in to do it, but have some kind of confidence and competence when you know the information to do your role, instead of just deferring to. I think that's the key for me, really. But that guidance is hopefully coming.
Brilliant, thank you, Nick. And again, as that comes online, let's see if we can point that to our attendees today and at future events. I think given the time, we're going to have to draw it to a close there. Nick, look, thank you as always, brilliant as always, loads of questions, and we'll share some of them with you. Well, share them all with you as well, because some nice comments from some friends and colleagues over the years there too. So thank you, Nick, and hopefully see you again very, very soon. If colleagues can put up my last slide, thank you very much. For us, this is a partnership that we've undertaken here between ourselves and IFE, and we want it very much to continue. So please do take the time to let the relevant people know, whether it's on feedback forms or via the IFE, of any sort of sessions that you want in the future. What do you want to look at? Who do you want us to invite to come and have a chat for one of these 1 hour periods? We find them invaluable, and we hope you do too. So from my perspective, a couple more things. We've got a few more events out through to the end of the year. On the 29th of November, we have another IFE BSI webinar looking at approved document B, and a bit of an update there as to recent developments. So I'm sure many of you will find that really useful too. And then we've got the Global Built Environment Summit, spread over 2 days, again virtual, but being undertaken in a different way this time. We've broken it down over 4 sessions, an AM and a PM session on 2 days. And we're looking at the realms of health and safety and well-being. I'll chair the first session on the 30th that morning, where we'll be joined by the HSE to give us a presentation on their role as the new building safety regulator in support of the Building Safety Act. And we'll be looking at construction products too as well. And then the rest of the day and a half would cover quality in construction and the built environment, digital in terms of cyber and physical infrastructure, and off-site construction, which might be of considerable interest to many of you on the webinar here today. I think all that's left for me to say is thank you, huge thank you to Nick, always a busy man, but always fantastic if you can secure him for a speaking event. So thank you, Nick. Thank you to you for taking the time out of your busy diaries to join us for this webinar series. I hope you found it useful. Please do give us the feedback. And thank you from me as well to the BSI team and the IFE team for making this all happen. We think it's really powerful, and it's a brilliant way of spreading what good looks like in terms of best practice and similar. So see you again soon. Have a good rest of the day. Bye for now.